Right now on Inside Utah Politics, Brad Wilson, the former Utah House Speaker, is running for Mitt Romney's seat in the U.S. Senate. We'll catch up with him about his campaign and what he hopes to accomplish if he's elected. Saving the Great Salt Lake. There's a new 5-year strategy to make sure the lake gets enough water. We'll talk to the group eager to get started with a little help from the legislature. And this week in Washington, banning TikTok in the U.S. potentially clears another hurdle. Find out what's next now that that bill has passed the House.
Time now for Inside Utah Politics.
And thank you for joining us this Sunday morning. I'm Brien McElhatten. Let's go inside politics, shall we? Our first guest is Brad Wilson, the former Speaker of the Utah House who left the legislature and is running for U.S. Senate. He hopes to replace Mitt Romney. Brad Wilson, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me. And
yes.
Welcome to Utah. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you very much. The landscape's a little bit different from Indiana, but we're loving it so far, so that's good. Thank you. I want to start with this question. Why the Senate? That's a big job. Why do you think you want to launch into this?
Yeah, well, I think we all know that there's a lot of important work done in the U.S. Senate, and what Utahns want and what Utahns have told me they need is someone back in Washington that's going to be a conservative and a conservative fighter that's going to go back and get our country back on track. And that's why I've decided to throw my hat in the ring to represent this amazing state in the U.S. Senate. There are some really big problems that our country faces right now. We all know what they are, whether it's the border or the reckless spending in Washington, D.C., all the things that the radical left is kind of taking us down right now, and we've got to get our country back on track. And I'm excited for the opportunity to go back to Washington and represent this great state.
Well, before we get into some of those issues, I want to ask you this. You served a number of years in the House as House Speaker, a number of other leadership positions too. What did you learn doing that you think you could apply to the Senate? Yeah.
Well, there are tough decisions that have to be made in Washington, D.C. And, you know, here in Utah, we do things right. While I was Speaker of the House here, I was able to get the largest tax cut in the history of the state passed times a factor of 4. At the same time, we balanced our budget. And just think, wouldn't it be great if we could actually do that in Washington, D.C.? And I want to take that skill set that I've created here in the state and take it back there. Utahns from all over the state in one way, shape, or form have said to me in different ways, Brad, when you get back to Washington, could you make Washington look a little bit more like Utah? Because they're proud of this state. We've got great people here, and we need to take our lessons that we've learned here and get Washington fixed.
I want to talk to you about one of the issues now on the mind of so many people, immigration, right? And I want to kind of couch this question within the latest numbers from Customs and Border Protection. A record number of migrant apprehensions at the border the past 3 years. Every year it's increasing. 2.3 million apprehensions in 2023, 2.2 in 2022, and 1.7 in 2021. So when you look at this issue just in terms of security on the border, how would you like to see that handled?
Well, I think what you just described is we don't have a border, and we need to close the border. And when Joe Biden became president, he opened the border up. We know he did that within the first few weeks of his presidency. And he has the ability to close the border now. And what we need is we need to elect a senator from Utah that's going to go back to Washington and fight to make that happen.
When you say close the border, what do you mean by that?
Well,
total closure of the border, no one across?
You know, under Donald Trump, when he was president, we had 200,000 people cross the border illegally. That was probably too many in that year. You know, last year, we had 330,000 people from Venezuela, just one country, encounter Border Patrol at the border. And we only sent 800 of them back. So we've got to do better. And this issue is affecting Utahns' pocketbooks. It's affecting our quality of life here. 2 examples real quick. We know that based on what we're seeing across this country and in Utah, that the average Utahn, average taxpayer, their share of the bill for the immigration crisis is $1,250 a year. We've got to have someone in Washington that's going to help fix that. I was up at a school in Heber City last week, and they are telling me that they have 4 new immigrant kids in their school every week in Heber City. This has got to be fixed, and we've got to send someone to Washington that's going to help fix this problem and get the border closed.
So would you support the completion of the border wall that Donald
Absolutely.
Trump talked about?
We need to build the wall. We need to give the Border Patrol the authority to do what they were doing just a few years ago under President Trump and secure the border. And here's what's crazy about this. President Biden has the ability to do that today if he wanted to, but he's choosing not to.
There's also talk about the backlog of immigration cases, people who are claiming asylum when they come across. Not enough immigration judges. That's causing a tremendous backup. How would you address that part of the equation?
Well, again, it goes to show that Congress has not been doing its job, and we need to send someone to Washington like me that's going to help fix this and get the Border Patrol and the immigration system the resources that it needs to manage this crisis. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's a national security crisis, and we haven't been taking it seriously enough as a country, and we need leaders that are going to go back and to Washington and do that.
John Curtis, who is also running for Senate, he's in Congress right now. He was on the program last week, and he talked about the need of balancing immigration reform with making sure we have enough migrant labor to help the economy here in Utah and across the country. How do you balance that?
Well, the first thing you've got to do is close the border. We can't have a realistic conversation about legal immigration until the border is closed. And then we can have that conversation. And I think it's a worthwhile conversation. I mean, this is the United States of America. We're a country of immigrants. But we've got to fix this, and we've got to have leadership in Washington that's willing to stand up and lean into the issue.
I want to ask you about the Great Salt Lake now. You shepherded some legislation that created the Great Salt Lake Water Enhancement Trust, and we're talking to them later on the program. But I want to ask you, now that their 5-year strategy has been made public and we're diving into that, if you were elected to the Senate, what kind of federal resources do you think could be mobilized to help us deal with the Great Salt Lake?
Yeah. Water is Utah's biggest issue going forward in terms of our ability for our kids and our grandkids to live here. And one of the things that makes me uniquely qualified to go back to Washington, D.C. and represent this state in the U.S. Senate is no one running in this race can come close to me in terms of their understanding and knowledge of water issues in the state. As Speaker of the House, it's the single issue I spent the most time on trying to help preserve water, conserve water, and really have a plan. That bill you talk about that created the 5-year plan, that was my doing, because I knew we needed to have a strategic plan for water, not just in the state, but to save the Great Salt Lake. And what we need is someone in Washington that's got a really deep understanding of all of Utah's water needs so that they can marshal federal resources to solve this problem. We can't solve Utah's water problem inside the borders of Utah. We've got to solve it regionally. And having someone in Washington that understands that, I think, would be a great advantage to the state of Utah.
Do you think the states can work together on this, because there's a disagreement between the upper basin Colorado River states and the the lower basin states on how to deal with water on the river there?
Sure.
That's a challenge right now when everyone's drying out.
Yeah, it is a challenge, but the fact of the matter is Utah had been going into this negotiation on the Colorado River with one arm tied behind our back, and we created the Colorado River Authority a few years ago. It was actually a bill that I ran. And we did that so that we had the resources and the expertise to go into that negotiation to preserve and protect Utah's water resources in the future. And so now we feel like we're going into these negotiations on a level playing field with these other states to make sure Utah's gets their fair share of the Colorado River. And I think that ultimately this will get worked out. It probably in some ways will end up needing to be dealt with in Washington, D.C. And again, I think that's a real advantage that we would have if I were back in the U.S. Senate, because I have got a lot of experience in this water policy space, more than anyone else.
I want to ask you this question as our time runs short. Housing, such an important issue here. We don't have enough houses. People are moving here because they love Utah. What do you think the federal government's role is in helping Utah figure out its housing program?
Well, I think that on something like this, the last thing we need is the federal government coming in and trying to solve this problem, right? I mean, the federal government's ability to solve local issues, we know it doesn't work well. This is an issue of supply and demand. And
you come from a housing background, the housing industry.
Well, sure, yeah. We know that the thing that will drive prices up more than anything is just lack of supply. And so we need to have government out of the way of providing supply so that our kids and our grandkids have a place to live. And it's a big, important issue for the state.
There's a conversation out there right now about potentially using public lands, potentially some federal public lands, as space on which to build new housing in western states and in western cities. Would you support looking into that?
Yeah, well, this whole public lands issue and debate in Utah is one that's been going on for a long time. And the federal government has not kept its commitment to Utah to turn over federal lands to the state. And one of the ways that they could help us solve our housing problem in the future is for the federal government to keep its commitment that was made to us when we became a state. But again, we've got to have some people in Washington, D.C. And when I get back there as a senator, that's one of the things that I will lean into and work on, is to make sure that the federal government keeps that commitment to Utah. And we can solve not just our housing problems in this state, but we can solve school funding issues. We can solve some of our recreation challenges. There's so many opportunities for us to do better with our federal lands here in the state of Utah. But we need to have people in Washington that are going to work on the issue the way that it needs to be addressed.
Okay, Brad Wilson, candidate for Senate, former Speaker of the House here in Utah. I wish we could talk all day. So many issues. It's hard to boil them down, but I appreciate the conversation.
Thank you.
We hope to see you again. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Absolutely. Still ahead here on Inside Utah Politics, easing the stress for first-time home buyers. Lawmakers in Washington are split on how to do that. Why some say money from the government is not the answer. And a bill that could ban TikTok in the U.S. is heading to the Senate. Here are the changes that lawmakers are demanding right now. Now, the House has passed legislation which could ban TikTok here in the U.S. potentially. And President Joe Biden says if Congress sends him that bill, he'd sign it into law. Our Washington correspondent Trevor Shirley is in D.C. with this.
The legislation comes amid growing concern over the Chinese government's ability to access data collected by TikTok.
This is a serious issue. We didn't come to it lightly.
Algorithms, tracking people. It's dangerous for our young people, and we got to find a way to rein it in.
As it stands, the bill would force the Chinese company ByteDance to sell its ownership of TikTok or face a U.S. ban.
What we're dealing with here is very specific concerns about the structure of this company and its relationship with the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party.
The FBI and the FCC warned ByteDance could share TikTok user data with the Chinese Communist Party, something TikTok denies. But some lawmakers worry a ban could limit the rights of Americans.
Some of us are concerned that there are First Amendment implications here. Americans have the right to view information.
Supporters argue that's not the case.
Our bill is not an act of censorship. It is a safeguard for our citizens, a firewall against foreign adversary-controlled applications.
Others say Congress needs a more comprehensive approach to all social media, not just TikTok.
We can't just single out one. I don't think we fully appreciate the impact this is going to have.
That was our Trevor Shirley reporting. And although the bill passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support, its future is less certain in the Senate. But now to lawmakers in Washington trying to make it easier for Americans to buy a home, but have different views on just how to do that. Washington correspondent Maddie Biertemple reports on a proposal that aims to help first-time home buyers.
Georgia Senator Raphael Warnock's Down Payment Toward Equity Act would give up to $20,000 to first-time homebuyers. It's meant to help cover down payments and closing costs.
It's difficult to overstate what a leg up that is for ordinary, hardworking people.
Warnock says home ownership is out of reach for many in his home state. He blames private investors for buying up property.
People are struggling. We're dealing with some difficult dynamics in the housing market.
But other lawmakers blame inflation and interest rates, saying more government assistance isn't the answer.
Typically, what government can do best from Washington is just to get out of the way.
South Carolina Senator Tim Scott told a committee that he's seen firsthand that federal subsidies just don't work.
Folks who are growing up today, where I grew up 50 years ago, simply cannot afford a home. Better today than they did 50 years ago.
Real estate analyst Jeff Ostrowski says the legislation would help some first-time buyers, but he says there's already a shortage of homes on the market.
So the concern from housing economists is if a federal program passes, it's going to push more people into the market and just drive prices up.
Ostrowski says a proposal by President Biden in his State of the Union to offer home sellers a tax credit could help that supply issue. In Washington, Maddie Biertemple.
Still ahead, saving the Great Salt Lake. There's a new strategy to bring more water into the lake. How does it work, and what can we expect? We'll talk about that next. Welcome back to Inside Utah Politics, everybody. We're going to talk about water now, the Great Salt Lake, and the rivers that feed it. There's a new 5-year strategy that aims to help heal the lake and deal with the challenges affecting it. And this is news that affects everybody. Our guest is Marcel Shoup with the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust. You also do work with the Audubon Society. So we wanted to have you on to talk about this new strategy. 5 years we're projecting out, right?
Right. The Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust is an effort that is co-led and managed by National Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy in Utah.
I can think of maybe no other issue in Utah that is so central to life here as water and the Great Salt Lake. I want to ask you about 100,000 acre-feet of water. This is a critical number in this strategy. Talk to me about the importance of that figure.
Sure. Well, so the trust was actually established about a year ago. And we've been very active getting it going and actually working on water transactions and wetlands projects for the lake. But we have wanted to set up at least a long-term strategy, so we've picked 5 years. We have several objectives, including by year 2028, having transacted 100,000 acre-feet of water, either protecting existing flows or bringing new flows to Great Salt Lake.
And for people who aren't familiar with the measure, an acre-foot, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the amount of water it would take to cover 1 acre with 1 foot of water.
That's right.
So that's a lot of water we're talking about.
It is a lot of water.
Right. And we need that water in the Great Salt Lake because it's lower than it should be. And we need to deal with the salinity issues in the lake, deal with the water levels in the lake, right? So how does this help the lake and push it forward, this 100,000 acre-feet a year?
So, you know, the trust and the work that we do is just one of many solutions that are needed to get water to Great Salt Lake and preserve it and keep the ecology healthy, manage salinity. So this is one of those contributions, and it's really maybe a unique partnership amongst a lot of folks. We have our organizations that are managing the trust. We have the state of Utah that has put up $40 million to get this effort kicked off. And we have a broad trust advisory council, broad-based interest trust advisory council, and then we're working with a number of partners. And so 100,000 acre-feet is probably about, you know, if you looked at the last 5 years of flow, on average, it was about 1.5 million acre-feet coming into the lake. So 100,000 acre-feet is about 6.5%.
So are you dealing with, you know, we talk about diversion of water to uses like agriculture and industry and in home use and that sort of thing. Lots of users of the water that goes into the lake. How do you bank 100,000 acre-feet of water a year?
Well, I don't know if it's really banked, but we have worked with the state of Utah on the donation from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for more than 20,000 acre-feet of water. So that's water that really comes through the Utah Lake Jordan River system to the south shores of Great Salt Lake, for example. And then we have a number of other water transactions that are actually moving through the Jordan River to the south end of Great Salt Lake, Farmington Bay, and Gilbert Bay. And so it's just every year, you may not always get the full volume because if there's not enough precipitation like we had in 2022, right, you're not going to have that much water. But if you do have that much water, then depending on where your water right sits in priority, you may have that water delivered, and last year was a banner year.
There's another part of this plan is restoring habitat, the wetlands surrounding the lake. And as someone who works with the Audubon Society, I know you have an appreciation for birds, and we know birds need the lake. It's part of their habitat, it's part of their migration. So tell me about the plan to restore the wetlands and the habitat.
So the legislation that set up the program to fund the trust actually provided that at least 25% of the funding would go towards protecting or restoring wetlands in the surrounding Great Salt Lake ecosystem in ways that would benefit the hydrology of the lake. So the wetlands ecosystem around the lake is really connected. It's part of one system, really. And ensuring that water is going to those wetlands or ensuring they're healthy also benefits the larger lake system. So last year, actually in July, we put out a request for proposals and received a number of proposals, and through a rigorous process, 8 projects were awarded $8.5 million to do restoration work, or in many cases, they're actually restoring water control structures, and many of those water control structures are actually an important conduit for the water that we've transacted or other water that's moving into the wetlands and then to the lake.
So your group is working with a bunch of stakeholders here, right? So industry, environmental advocates, the legislature, right? We talked about a little bit about the funding that you have. How do you get everyone to agree on an approach here?
I think with Great Salt Lake, it's interesting. There are a lot of diverse interests, but everybody really cares about keeping that ecosystem healthy. And even though they may have other interests that they are there to serve, for example, a water conservancy district that's providing water to municipalities, they also realize the importance of keeping Great Salt Lake healthy. We all live here and we all depend on it. And so it's really about, trying to talk through ideas and solutions and coordinating. And I've been actually, I don't want to say I've been surprised, but I've been certainly so excited about how much other organizations and other people really want to see the lake be healthy and share water.
What's at stake if we lose the lake?
If Great Salt Lake were to decline precipitously, it could be very disastrous, I think, for the local communities, for our state. Obviously, the first one that comes to mind for many people is air quality. But it also has wide ramifications for, the economy, just our quality of life here, but also in the region. When you think about the birds that are connected regionally and millions, some 10 million, that rely on the lake as they fly through, going north or south.
So this is an ecological issue. This is a public health issue. This touches so many facets of our lives and the natural world around us. I wanted to set the stakes because what else do you need from the legislature at this point? I know they've been on board. You've had some funding. What else do you need from them to really ensure the success of the program?
Well, thanks. It's been over the last, say, 5 years, the legislature has really moved quite rapidly when you think about Western water law in terms of making changes in policy. And our organization, as well as many others, are now trying to implement some of those tools like in-stream flow. And so part of what we've actually received, which is policy changes that help us do the work that we want to do. And then, we've received funding. They're funding a lot of, great deal of funding going towards agricultural water optimization. And as we look forward trying to achieve this 100,000 acre goal for water, we know that the funding we have so far won't be enough to get us that far, but we need to show that we can do what we're trying to do and prove the concept, and then also spend the money we have, but recognizing that we need to work with many policy holders, at the state level, the local level, and then with private entities as well, to try to come up with the resources we need to actually achieve those types of goals. And we're also working closely with the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, which also has received funding this year to implement some water projects as well. Well,
it's a big strategy and a lot is on the line, but it sounds like there are so many people working together to see this thing through, this 5-year strategy. Marcel Shoup, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
I really appreciate it. And by the way, folks, if you want to see the plan for yourself, you can head to our website, abc4.com. You'll see that 5-year strategy laid out there. You can read it for yourself. Inside Utah Politics will be right back. And thank you for joining us here on Inside Utah Politics. You can watch us here every Sunday morning at 8 o'clock. You can also find us online at abc4.com. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next week.